Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine stepping back into the early 1980s, specifically to a resort town, seemingly quiet place, tucked away in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California.
Keddie. That's the place.
Keddie, right.
Yeah.
And the date, the night of April 11th leading into April 12th, 1981.
And the peace of that little town was just absolutely shattered the next morning. A horrific scene discovered in house number 28.
Yeah, not just a crime. It was, well, a brutal quadruple homicide.
Exactly. And that's our focus today, the Keddie murders. It's a case that, remains stubbornly unsolved decades later.
We've pulled together the key facts, crucial insights from a pretty detailed account of this whole complex, chilling investigation.
Our mission here is to sort of guide you through the known details, look at the initial investigation, its challenges.
Yeah, and explore the surprising discoveries that came much later. Plus, wrestle with those questions that still hang over this terrible event.
Absolutely.
This is a case with a lot of detail. It can feel overwhelming, Conflicting info, real human tragedy. Navigating it, finding those critical takeaways. That's exactly what we're here for. So let's start by understanding who was living in that house.
Okay, so at the center was Glenna Susan Sharp, but people called her Sue.
Sue Sharp.
Right. She was a mother, moved her 5 kids out to Northern California from Connecticut. This was back in '79, after separating from her husband.
And they didn't move straight into house 28, did they?
No, initially they were in a trailer nearby in Quincy, but then by the fall of '79, they moved into that larger house, number 28, right in the Keddie Resort area.
Okay, and her kids living there were, let's see, John, he was 15, Sheila, 14, Tina, 12.
Then the younger ones, Rick, who was 10, and Greg, just 5 years old.
5 kids, okay. So let's paint the picture of that specific day, April 11th, 1981. What were people doing, the movements leading up to that night?
Well, the sources say the morning seemed pretty normal. About 11:30 a.m., Sue, Sheila, and little Greg went into Quincy.
To pick up Rick from baseball tryouts, right?
Yeah, exactly. And on their way back, they actually spotted John, the oldest boy, and his friend Dana Wingate, he was 17.
And they were hitchhiking.
Yeah, towards Keddie. So Sue gave them a ride back to the house.
But John and Dana didn't stick around long.
No, seems not. Later that afternoon, maybe 3:30 p.m., they were seen hitchhiking again, but this time back towards Quincy.
Maybe going to visit friends.
Possibly. They were definitely seen downtown in Quincy that afternoon. That detail, their movements, it's important later.
Definitely. Okay, so what about the other kids?
Well, Sheila, the 14-year-old, she had plans to spend the night next door.
At the Seabolt family's place, house number 27.
Right. She left the Sharp house just after 8:00 p.m.
And Tina, the 12-year-old.
Interesting thing there. She'd also been over at the Seabolts watching TV, but she came back home to number 28 around 9:30 p.m. Apparently asked what time it was just before she left.
So 9:30 p.m., Tina's back home. Who else is in house 28 at that point as the evening wears on?
Okay, so you've got Sue, you've got the 2 youngest boys, Rick and Greg, and their friend, Justin Smart, was there too, having a sleepover.
Right, Justin Smart.
Yeah.
Which sets the stage for, well, the horror of the next morning.
Yeah, the discovery.
Who found them, and what exactly did they walk into?
It was Sheila. She came back home from the Seabolts the next morning, April 12th, around 10:00 a.m., and she's the one who found them.
And the scene, the sources describe it as just horrific.
Utterly. She found Sue, her brother John, and John's friend Dana Wingate, all in the living room.
And they were bound.
Yes, bound with medical tape and electrical cords.
Restrained, but chillingly Tina, the 12-year-old. She wasn't there.
No, missing from the scene, completely gone.
But the younger kids, Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin Smart, they were okay.
Found unharmed in an adjacent bedroom, which must have been, immediately baffling for investigators, right? Why them? Why were they spared?
Exactly. And there was some potential scene contamination early on?
Well, possibly. Jamie Seabolt from next door, he came over when Sheila screamed. Understandably, he retrieved the younger boys through the bedroom window.
Logical thing to do, get the kids out.
Totally. But he also apparently went into the house briefly through the back door. It's understandable in the chaos, but yeah, it could have potentially impacted the scene's integrity.
Okay, and the scene itself, the living room. Extreme violence.
Oh, absolutely. The sources mention 2 bloodied knives were found, and a hammer.
A hammer, okay.
And the blood spatter evidence, that was key. It strongly suggested the attacks happened right there in the living room.
Let's talk about the victim's injuries, the autopsy details. It's grim, but important. Sue,
Sue was found nude from the waist down. She'd been gagged with a bandana and her own underwear secured with tape, stab wound to the chest,
And her throat.
slashed horizontally, deep, through the larynx, even nicking the spine, plus a head injury consistent with being hit by the butt of Daisy Bee's rifle. They found the rifle there.
Oh, wow. What about John, her son?
John also had his throat slashed, and severe blunt force trauma to the head, looked like from one or maybe even more hammers.
Hammers, plural, potentially.
Right.
And Dana Wingate, John's friend.
Multiple head injuries, again, consistent with hammers, but his official cause of death was listed as manual strangulation, though he also suffered that blunt force trauma.
So just to recap the official causes.
Yeah.
Sue and John, knife wounds and blunt force trauma. Dana, asphyxiation plus the trauma.
Yeah.
Just brutal.
Truly brutal. And yet, despite all that violence, the initial investigation immediately ran into some peculiar roadblocks, starting with what wasn't heard.
Right. The Seabolts, right next door at number 27.
Reported hearing absolutely nothing suspicious all night. Nothing.
But then, someone else did.
Yeah, strangely, a couple in house number 16, a bit further away, they claimed they were woken up around 4:15 a.m.
By what?
by what sounded like muffled screaming. It's a really puzzling discrepancy, isn't it? Why would they hear it further away but not the immediate neighbors?
It really is. So suspicion. Who did it fall on early on?
Well, investigators quickly looked at a few people. Justin Smart's stepfather, Martin Smart, was one.
Why him specifically?
He told police a claw hammer was missing from his home.
A hammer. Okay, that connects.
And also a man named John Boobade. He was reportedly staying with Smart at the time, and there were allegations, rumors of ties to organized crime in Chicago.
Interesting. Were there any other leads made from neighbors, things they saw?
Yes, actually. Several neighbors, including the Seabolts again, mentioned seeing a green van.
A green van.
Parked at the Sharp house around 9:00 p.m. on the night of April 11th. That detail, the green van, it pops up early.
Okay. Then there's the testimony of the young boy, Justin Smart. That seems complicated.
Very complicated. The sources highlight he gave conflicting stories. At one point, he apparently said he dreamed some details.
Seen them.
But later, under hypnosis, which is controversial in itself, he described seeing Sue with two men. Relying on a young kid's account, especially one that changes, is really tricky for investigators.
Absolutely. And that led to the sketches, right? The composite sketches.
Oh, yeah. One of the most criticized parts of the whole early investigation. These sketches were done by an amateur, someone with, no forensic training.
Based on Justin's description?
Based on Justin's descriptions. And the descriptions were quite specific, two men, late 20s, early 30s, one taller, dark blonde hair, the other shorter, black, greased hair, both wearing gold-framed sunglasses.
Sunglasses at night. And using an amateur artist when presumably professionals were available.
Yeah.
That decision just seems bizarre. It raises questions about, the resources or the priorities back then.
It really stands out as a potential misstep, yeah.
What about motive? Were there early theories floating around?
There were rumors, yeah. Talk of ritualistic killings, maybe drug trafficking involvement, but Sheriff Doug Thomas, he dismissed those pretty quickly, within the week after the murders.
McGrain.
Said flat out, no drugs, no drug paraphernalia found anywhere in the house.
Okay. And Tina's disappearance, how was that handled initially? She's missing from this horrific scene.
Right, so her being missing was initially looked at by the FBI as a possible abduction. Makes sense.
Federal involvement.
Yeah, but only for a few weeks. Reports then indicated the FBI had, quote, backed off. Their reasoning was apparently that the state investigation was sufficient.
Backing off on a potential child abduction linked to a triple homicide. That seems significant, maybe. Especially looking back now.
It could be seen that way, yeah. Reducing federal resources early on.
So Keena wasn't found with the others. The FBI steps back relatively quickly. And she just stayed missing for years.
3 years. Exactly 3 years to the day the others were found, actually. April 11th, 1984. That's when her remains were finally discovered.
By who? And where?
A bottle collector, just somebody out looking for bottles, found a cranium and part of a mandible near Feather Falls. It's in Butte County. About 62 miles from Keddie. Quite a distance.
62 miles. Wow. And they confirmed it was Tina.
Yep. A forensic pathologist confirmed the identification in June 1984. But there's a really fascinating and frankly suspicious detail about that discovery, isn't there?
Yes. Tell us about that.
Okay, so shortly after the remains were found and announced, the Butte County Sheriff's Office gets an anonymous phone call.
And the caller?
identifies the remains as Tina's, before official confirmation. But here's the kicker. This call, this potentially crucial tip, it wasn't documented in the initial reports.
Not documented. How is that possible?
It gets weirder. It wasn't until after 2013, decades later, that a deputy working the cold case found an actual tape recording of that anonymous call, just buried in an evidence box.
A tape recording existed all along. Why wasn't it documented? Who made that call? That piece of information just surfacing years later. It's incredible, raises so many questions.
Huge questions. Why was it seemingly ignored or lost? Who knew it was Tina so early?
Anyway, meanwhile, the house itself, number 28.
It stood there for a long time, didn't it? Yeah, until 2004. Then it was finally demolished. But the story, obviously, it wasn't over. Decades later, the case saw some pretty crucial developments.
This is where it gets really interesting, connecting back to those early persons of interest. Let's look at Martin Smart again, Justin's stepfather.
Right. So a 2016 article brought some things to light. Apparently, he moved to Reno, Nevada, pretty soon after the murders.
Okay. And while he was in Reno, there was a letter.
He sent a letter to his wife, Marilyn. And the specific quote from that letter, I mean, it's chilling, especially now. It reportedly ended with the line,
What did it say?
"I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives."
Wow. Bought it with 4 people's lives. If he's talking about Keddie, that sounds like.
It sounds like an admission, doesn't it? And the source we looked at notes this letter was somehow overlooked initially, never admitted as evidence.
Overlooked. A letter from a key person of interest, basically saying he killed 4 people. How does that get overlooked? That seems like a massive failure in the early investigation. Just letting potential evidence like that sit there.
It's hard to understand, and the connections to Smart, they get deeper. There are claims from a counselor he saw regularly.
What did the counselor claim?
Allegedly, Smart confessed to the counselor that he killed Sue and Tina.
Sue and Tina specifically.
Yeah, reportedly told the counselor he killed Tina because she was a witness, to stop her identifying him. But he denied killing the boys, John and Dana.
So that alleged confession, if true, it partly aligns Sue and the missing child, but it's a slightly different scenario than all 3 adults being killed together. Maybe explains why the boys in the other room were unharmed.
It adds a layer of complexity, doesn't it? And a potential motive. Silencing a witness.
Okay, what about the other guy, John Bouvety? The one supposedly staying with Smart with alleged mob ties.
Well, Booby died back in 1988, so that was before these later revelations about Smart really came out.
So we might never know his exact role, if any.
Probably not. His alleged organized crime connections just add another strange dimension, you know? Was he involved? Did he influence Smart? It's speculation now.
But then, actual physical evidence connected to Smart did surface, much later.
Yes. March 2016. A hammer was found.
Not the hammer, but a hammer.
A hammer found in a local pond by a special investigator named Mike Gamberg, who took a fresh look at the case. And crucially, it matched the description of the hammer Martin Smart claimed was missing from his home right after the murders.
The same type of hammer he reported missing. Found dumped in a pond years later.
Exactly. And the sheriff at the time, Sheriff Hagwood, specifically said the location where it was found suggested it was put there deliberately, intentionally concealed.
Finding a potential murder weapon, matching the one reported missing by a prime suspect, in a place suggesting deliberate disposal, it's huge. It points right back at Smart, doesn't it?
I feel like a pretty direct link.
Yeah.
And then maybe the biggest potential breakthrough came just a couple of years after that, April 2018.
What happened then?
Gamberg, the investigator, announced that DNA had been recovered.
DNA? From where?
From a piece of surgical tape found back at the original crime scene in 1981, and he said it matched a known living suspect.
Wow, a DNA match. From tape at the scene to a living person. After all this time.
That's the kind of thing cold case investigators hope for, isn't it? It provides a specific person, someone alive today, definitively linked by physical evidence to that horrific scene.
So let's just recap this newer stuff. We've got Martin Smart's chilling letter mentioning 4 people's lives. We've got his alleged confession to a counselor saying he killed Sue and Tina. We have a hammer matching his missing one, found dumped deliberately. And now, DNA from the crime scene matching a known living suspect.
It's a lot. It really is.
And yet, despite all of that, the case is still officially unsolved, which really highlights those criticisms of the initial investigation, doesn't it?
It really does. That comment you mentioned earlier from another investigator saying someone just coming out of the academy would have gone better. It feels pretty pointed when you hear about potentially overlooked letters and undiscovered tapes of anonymous calls.
Seems like fundamental errors might have been made early on. errors that hampered things for decades, maybe let leads go cold, let people avoid justice.
It certainly looks that way.
Which brings us to the core question. When we connect all this back to you, our listener,
Right. What does all this actually mean? Why, after all these years with this compelling evidence emerging, even if it's circumstantial in parts and complex, why does Keddie still grab our attention? And why is it still officially unsolved?
I think it's that sheer combination of things, isn't it? The awful, brutal details of the crime itself. The fact that potential suspects like Smart and Boubaid were right there, highlighted early on.
Then the conflicting accounts, like Justin's testimony versus the neighbors hearing nothing or maybe hearing muffled screams.
And the specific evidence found so much later, that anonymous call tape, the hammer seeming to point in certain directions, and now the DNA match, tying a living person directly to the scene. It's just layer upon layer.
It really is. And it's a case where time has been both an enemy and, weirdly, an ally.
How do you mean?
Well, the passage of time obviously hurts investigations, memories fade, evidence degrades, people die. But it also helped here, right? Through DNA technology advancing and through dedicated cold case work finally uncovering stuff that was missed or buried before.
That's a good point. And we can't forget the impact, the enduring impact on the surviving Sharp children, on that small community. This isn't just some abstract puzzle. It's a profound tragedy for real people.
Absolutely. And the challenges in the Keddie case, they really spotlight the broader problems in cold case work generally. You know, evidence fragility, reliance on memory, just the incredibly long, hard road to maybe finding justice, even when new leads finally pop up decades down the line.
So, to kind of wrap it up,
Yeah.
we have this terrible, brutal crime. A missing child whose remains turn up years later under suspicious circumstances. Leads that went cold for decades.
And then this cascade of modern discoveries. A letter that sounds like a confession, an alleged actual confession, a hammer found dumped, DNA matching a living suspect.
Yet, still no official resolution, no final answer.
Which leaves us with that final thought, that lingering question. Given everything we've discussed, especially the newer evidence like the hammer and that DNA match pointing to a known living suspect, why has this case remained officially unsolved? What does this persistent lack of closure, despite these breakthroughs, tell us about the really deep-seated challenges of uncovering the full, definitive truth in cases that have gone cold for this long? Especially when the initial investigation faced such serious criticism.
That's the question, isn't it? What does it take? That's the question that still echoes from Keddie.